Do you know what? A question that I often get asked about when I'm travelling by other travellers or interested people is how many countries have you been to? And do you know what? That's actually a lot harder to answer than you may think. Why? You might say, pretty straightforward. Have you been to that country? Yes or no? But the fact is, where it gets hard is when we say, well, what actually constitutes a country? Because in my list, it could be somewhere in between the mid-50s to 60. Because there's a handful of countries that, well, are they countries? Yes or no? What do I mean by this? Well, we can look at the obvious. France is a country. Yeah? It's got borders, it's recognised by the UN, it's got a capital, we know where it is, it's even got its own language. Hasn't got its own currency, mind you, these days, but that's not really a problem. Okay, so France is a country. Is Britain? Or is it four? Because, do you know what? Scotland, they've got their own banknotes, as of Northern Ireland. Wales haven't, but they all have their own national museums. And actually Wales, apart from England, is the only one with its own language. They've all got histories of being independent at one time. They all have separate laws. But they're all part of Britain. So I personally don't count Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as separate countries. Some people would do though. And let's be honest, within a couple of years' time, Scotland may even be recognised as an independent country internationally. And recognising internationally is important, because that's where we get into difficult ground. Back in 2009, I went here. The Republic of Kosovo. Now, is that a country or not? We've all heard of Kosovo because of the conflict there in 1999. It's a small place near to Albania, Macedonia and Serbia. And Serbia claims that Kosovo is part of Serbia. It certainly was a part of Yugoslavia before Serbia existed, and it's never been an independent country. But because there was an Albanian majority there, about 90%, then when Slobodan Milosevic and his government started banning the Albanian language in schools and basically trying to ethnic cleanse the Albanians, the international community moved in, and it's now a UN protectorate. What does that mean? That means that officially it's still part of Serbia, but you can't actually travel from Serbia to Kosovo. If you want to go to Kosovo, you've got to go through Macedonia, Montenegro, I think there is a connection, and the way I came, through Albania. So, you can't even go from one part of that country to another if it's still part of Serbia. Its language, it's totally different than Serbian. It's Albanian. There are small enclaves, small Serbian villages. I went to one, Gračanica, which are where Serbian money is still used and the Serbian language is still heard. But in most of the country, the lingua franca is Albanian, and the money is the euro, which is not actually the official currency, but it was used because that was easiest for the NATO peacekeeping forces. But to make it even more complicated, Kosovo then declared independence. Now, understandably, Serbia said, no, you can't do that. But Kosovo did, and now they are calling themselves an independent country. What's more, most of the world's major countries have recognised them. In fact, there's about 70 or 80 countries that so far have recognised Kosovo, including Britain, and all the other EU countries except, I think it's Greece. Some of their neighbours as well. Bulgaria has. America has. But Russia and China haven't. And that is why it's not recognised as a real country by the UN. So it's not given UN member status, doesn't have an Olympic team, doesn't have an international football team, because there has to be a majority of members that accept it. And there isn't at the moment. And you might say, well, why not? Okay, for Serbia we can understand why they wouldn't want Kosovo to be an independent country, and Russia because they've traditionally supported the Serbs. But why not China? Well, this is where the politics come into it. Because, what does China have within its borders? It has areas that would perhaps like to be independent. Like Xinjiang, which I visited back in 2002. They speak Uyghur. Uyghur is the main language there. And it's got a very different culture and history to China, to the rest of China. And then, of course, there's Tibet. So, if China starts recognising breakaway republics like Kosovo, then surely its own wannabe breakaway republics like Xinjiang, like Tibet, can turn around and say, well, are you going to recognise us? And there too goes why into Russia might well not recognise Kosovo. Yes, they've traditionally been friends with Serbia, but at the same time, they've got a few republics themselves who want to break away. Most famous of all being Chechnya. So, the idea of international recognition is an important one. But let's be honest, huge swathes of the globe do recognise Kosovo. And it is, to all intents and purposes, an independent country. I remember when I was actually entering Serbia on the train, somebody asked me, said, is this your first visit to Serbia? And I said, well, maybe yes, maybe no. And I said, what do you mean? I said, well, I would perhaps say it is, but you would perhaps say it isn't. And they're like, I don't get it. Well, I've been to Kosovo. Is that Serbia? And they laughed. But, you know, that's where it can get complicated. Now, so Kosovo's one of the trickier ones. There are some others, though. What about this place? Here's my little flag that I bought back from Transnistria, or Transdniester, or the Dniester Republic. Pridnistrova is its Russian name. Where's that? Well, you won't find it on any map. You will find Kosovo on some maps, but you won't find this one on any maps. Why? Because it doesn't exist. This, Transnistria, is part of Moldova. And if you ever look at a map of Moldova, and Moldova's kind of like that shape, getting thinner at the top and the bottom, right? And there is the west, there is the east. This thin strip here, only a few miles across, but rather long, for the whole length of Moldova, is Transnistria. And why does it exist? Because when the Soviet Union broke up, Moldova was kind of overtaken by Romanian nationalism, because most of the Moldovans are Romanian. But in the Transnistria area, they're mostly Russian, and they didn't like the fact that the Soviet Union had broken up, and they did not want to be either part of a Romanian-dominated Moldova, or worse still in their eyes, union with Romania itself, where they're a tiny, tiny minority. So they declared independence. After they declared independence, there was a war. People died fighting, and Transnistria won. In fact, their army today is probably bigger than Moldova's, which is not saying a lot. But if you go to Transnistria, in many ways it's more of an independent country than France, because it does have its own currency. Not a very good one, but it does have it. And it does have its border controls, which, for example, France doesn't have because it's a Schengen country. And it does have a lot of the other trappings of a nation state. In fact, there are very few connections with Moldova. But there's also a few strange anomalies because it's not recognised by anyone else, not even Russia, whose troops are helping to protect it. Why? Well, I'll give you an example. You go into Transnistria and you go to a post office and say, I'd like a stamp. And they say, well, where do you want to send the letter to? Within Transnistria or outside of Transnistria? That might not sound like a stupid question, but in Transnistria it's very important, because if it's within Transnistria, you must use a Transnistrian stamp. But if it's outside of Transnistria, you have to use a Republic of Moldova stamp, because nobody else recognises Transnistrian stamps. So, you know, that's kind of quirky. And also, I went to the capital, Tiraspol, and there are foreign embassies there. But they're foreign embassies of countries that don't exist, such as breakaway republics in the Caucasus, South Ossetia, which I've not been to, but I've seen from the Georgian town of Gori, which lies just south of its border, and Abkhazia, which is another breakaway region of Georgia, or Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a breakaway region of Azerbaijan full of Armenians. And they have embassies in Tiraspol. Nobody else does, because nobody else recognises it. And I just think this is really... I love these kind of quasi-states, semi-states, I don't know what you would call them, because I just think they're fascinating that you can go to these little corners of the world where people are living their own lives. They're existing in the state that they want to be in, and yet it's totally unknown about in the rest of the world. And I just think it's one of those brilliant things about travel. And I love to, people say, where are you going on holiday this year? Oh yes, I'm going to Transnistria. And they're like, where? And they're like, yeah, Transnistria, you must know where that is. Oh, never seen it on a map. No, you won't, because it ain't there. But it's fascinating. And whilst I myself am actually committed anti-nationalist, I think nationalism is very harmful, I do like the quirkiness that sometimes comes as a side effect of it. Although I don't think I'd want to live in one of these states, because most of them seem to be economic disasters. One that is well known, and is again on this quasi-state status, is here. A place I spent a lot of time. Israel, very much a state, and the Palestinian territories. Is Palestine a state? Well, I suppose the answer we would have to say is no, it isn't. It has declared independence, kind of more times than most people can remember, and it would have the support of the majority of the UN, except that Israel is not going to allow that one. But do you know what? The lands that would constitute a Palestinian state, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, were never officially made part of Israel. They were captured in the 1967 war, and on many maps, Palestine is seen as being part of Jordan or Egypt. And even today, because of the peace process started by Yitzhak Rabin before he was tragically murdered by one of his own people, Palestine does have a status, but it's a very strange one. And nowhere is that more strange than Hebron, which is somewhere that I went in 2009. And Hebron is a Palestinian town. It has Palestinian police on the streets. It's totally Palestinian. You won't see Hebrew anywhere. It's all Arabic. But the road leading to Hebron is an Israeli-controlled road. And it goes past some villages, which are Palestinian, and some settlements, which are Israeli. So it's a very much, you don't know where you are, going through the West Bank outside the towns, but inside Hebron, it's totally Palestinian. There's no sign that Israel exists until you go to the little enclave in the middle of Hebron, where there is a Jewish settlement, and I did it by accident, and it was one of my most powerful, and to be quite frank, frightening travel experiences, as I was walking through this market in Hebron. And so I'm just walking along, and suddenly the whole road's gone quiet. And I'm the only guy there, and I'm thinking, whoa, what's happening here? And then I looked along, and both sides of the street, there were shutters on all the shops. And then I looked up, and there was a grill across the top of the street, and people had thrown wine bottles and, well, other things that you wouldn't want to mention down on the grill. And above that there was Israeli soldiers with machine guns peeping out of watchtowers. And I walked down this street, certainly the only person walking around there, got to a little square at the end, and there was a military border checkpost. And as soon as I'd gone out down the street, this border checkpost opened, and a platoon of Israeli soldiers came out in full combat gear, brandishing M16s, and they went up the street that I'd just gone down, and it was like watching an episode of News at 10. Now, basically, what happened is Jewish settlers took over an area in the centre of Hebron. In part of the area they took over, the ground floor of the buildings is Palestinian, but the upstairs was Israeli. And that street was a Palestinian street, but the upstairs was Israeli, and by accident I had to walk down. And later I actually went into the Jewish enclave, and because I wanted to get to a particular holy building, the Cave of the Patriarchs. And to get in, you have to pass through what is essentially like a border control. You have to show your passport, you have to be scanned. It's a lot stricter than many border controls. And then when I was in, it might have been as if the Arabs never existed, because it was totally Israeli and there was Hebrew everywhere. And funnily enough, actually, when I tried to go back, an Israeli soldier stopped me and said, "You can't go there, mate." And I said, "Well, why not? I've just come from there." And he says, "Oh, you're not Jewish?" I said, "No, I'm Christian." And he's like, "Oh yeah, you can go there, no problem." He said, "I thought you were Jewish." "You can't go there, that's Arab." And I think that day I was the only guy that crossed over, despite the fact that there was, thousands of people living on both sides of that little border. So, in many ways Palestine is a state. It has many attributes of a state. And there is some degree of legal recognition. It's on the UNESCO panel in the United Nations, for example. I want to finish off this talk about, the quasi-countries that I've been to by talking about one that I've never been to, but I think I would love to go to. And that one, I learned about it about 5 years ago when I was doing jury service. And I met a guy called Carlos the Chicken. His real name was Steve, and he was a radio ham and a rock DJ. And he began telling me about a country called the Principality of Sealand, and he was actually a noble of the Principality of Sealand. He was Lord Steve Rowney, and basically he knew about it because of his interest in radios. But what had happened is, in the 60s, when the whole pirate radio thing had set about, a pirate radio guy had occupied a fort in the Thames estuary that was built during World War II to protect against German invasion. And that fort, I he hadn't been able to keep that, so he then occupied one further out. And it was about 11 miles off the shore of Essex. And he stayed there, and the British government couldn't move him because it was actually outside of territorial waters, which were 3 miles. And what he did is he declared independence. He said, "This fort," and it's literally, it looks like an oil rig. He said, "This fort is the Principality of Sealand. It is my country. I am the monarch. I'm the Prince of Sealand." And so what the British government did is they extended their territorial waters to 12 miles out, which would engulf it. But the day before, he extended the Sealand territorial waters to also 12 miles, so the international boundary would be somewhere in between. And the I don't know the Royal Navy of the Coast Guard actually tried to furk them off, and they fired at them with the World War II guns that were on there. And he was taken to court in Essex, and the court actually declared that he should not be punished because he was outside of British territorial jurisdiction, which means, therefore, that it's not Britain. And so, in a roundabout way, it was recognised as a separate country. Sealand too has had its own passport, its own stamps, its own flags, its own national anthem, everything. Even though it's about the size of this living room, and well, at most there's probably only about 2 people living there. But there may only be 2 people living there, but it does have its own football team, and you can be a noble of Sealand if you support the Sealand idea. And I think, as an international traveller who likes to seek out quasi-states, the Sealand ideal is something that I really do support. And so, here we are. This is me, Lord Matthew of Sealand. And if there's one place I want to go in the future, that is it. If anyone wants to sponsor me for a trip to Sealand, you can make trips these days. You let me know. In the meantime, thank you for listening to Uncle Travelling Matt. Please subscribe and please visit my blog on http://Matthew E. Poynton blogspot.com. Thank you very much. Bye.